Hey everyone, how are you? Is everybody full? Did everyone else eat as much ice cream as I did? I'm Pamela Tourigny. I'm moderating the panel discussion today, and I'm the co-founder of Ottawa VegFest, although I'm no longer involved, except for in this capacity here right now. So I was asked to moderate this because of that background, but also because of how I came to a vegan lifestyle. So I've been vegan for 15 years now. I'm sure, if you're here, some of you are aware, at least on some level, of the environmental impact of animal agriculture. So I grew up on a farm, and then I came to Ottawa to go to university, and I was doing my undergrad around the turn of the century, and I learned about the Earth's carrying capacity and overpopulation and how much resource it was taking for us to produce meat and animal products. And it was a no-brainer for me when I learned that. So I've been waiting for about 20 years for everybody else to learn this information and start to implement changes both on a personal level and a policy level. It's been thrilling to me to see the United Nations and World Health Organizations and all these important world policymakers starting to take this seriously. So I had written little intros for these guys, and I'll just try to run through that really quickly because I think there's some stuff that Edelweiss didn't mention. We have John Stone here. Let's hear it for John. John's an adjunct Carleton University professor and environmental geologist. Among his many professional credentials, prior to his retirement, he served as the Executive Director, Climate Change for the Meteorological Service of Canada, Environment Canada. So I think we can say he knows what he's talking about. Then we have Carolina Krim, right beside me here. She's a recent graduate of the Environmental Science Program at Ottawa U. She spent 4 years learning about how the Earth and its ecosystems have changed from their inception to the present time. She's now organizes with Climate Justice Ottawa to encourage climate change and a Green New Deal at the local and national level. She'll be talking about the loss of biodiversity in the context of animal agriculture. We have Annie, Bernatchez. Okay, she's a doctoral student and social scientist whose research focuses on the relationship between animal justice activism and state repression in Canada and elsewhere. And she aims to critique speciesism and capitalism in which animal lives are exploited and oppressed. And then finally, Ikram Abdul. She's an activist with a number of organizations in Ottawa, and her focus is on unifying socially conscious people to create a new social paradigm, especially around animal welfare, environment, and climate change. So I have a number of questions that I'll be posing to our panelists here. It'll be one at a time to one panelist, and then if anyone else has anything you want to jump in with, that's cool, but I reserve the right to shut things down if you're taking too long and going over time. So we have 2 questions for each, and then an opportunity for them to provide any closing remarks, and then we'll take some questions from the floor. Does that sound good? All right, let's do it. Kicking it old style here with some paper. So we'll start with Carolina. We've heard that populations of vertebrate species have dropped by 60% in the past 50 years, and that 1 million of the plant's 8 million species are at high risk of extinction. That's 1 in 8. How is that playing out here in Canada? And what is the current state of Canadian biodiversity? If you want to take just, say, 3 or 4 minutes.
Yeah, so obviously some scary statistics have come out recently. But before I address how it's looking in Canada, I just want to clarify some things about how biodiversity loss is looking globally. So a few years ago, the World Wildlife Fund said that humans specifically were responsible for 60% of vertebrate wildlife population loss from 1970 to 2014. So obviously many species aren't doing well, and it's a lot of our faults. And a month ago, the UN report on biodiversity said that 1 million species are threatened with extinction, as you mentioned, and that people have altered 75% of Earth's land and 66% of marine ecosystems on Earth. And so obviously not doing good, and that's been since pre-industrial times. So it's been said before that we're in the middle of a 6th mass extinction right now because there's been 5 before, although some scientists are hesitant to say that because there's always gray lines on when you start measuring loss and how many percent of species have been lost, because there's so many species that have already gone extinct and that are here now that we just don't know about. But we do know for a fact that the rate of species loss is increasing, and we're losing species tens to hundreds of times faster than before. So in Canada specifically, according to the Living Planet report, half of wildlife species populations have declined from 1970 to 2017, and the average percentage of loss is 83%. So they're not extinct, but a lot of them have been lost. And looking at the rates and numbers of loss that we're experiencing, we're losing mostly plants, and then followed by freshwater fish, invertebrates, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and birds. So that does look kind of bleak, but it is important to note also that there's over 600 species currently being monitored and protected under Canada's Species at Risk Act, and that the majority of them are labeled as secure. They aren't at risk of extinction right now. So there might be a bit of difference between the Living Planet report that has all these declines and the Species at Risk Act that's showing that most of them are stable, but that's probably because even if a species starts with a large enough number, even a loss of 50% might still be stable as long as they're above the minimal viable population size. So they can lose 50% but still be okay for now, not saying that 50% loss is a good thing at all. And so also according to a report by NatureServe, from the mid-1800s to 2017, there's been 109 species that used to be found in Canada and no longer are, although they are found in other parts of the world. And there's only been, it's still not good, but 6 species that have gone extinct globally in Canada. So that's to give some numbers behind it. And some species that we've lost in Canada that are still found elsewhere but still aren't doing good are like the Carner blue butterfly and the greater prairie chicken. So while it doesn't look too good, I know Edelweiss said that we'd probably be talking about the positivity here, and I've just given more sad statistics. But to play devil's advocate a little bit, not that I agree with this, but people could argue that extinction is the natural fate of all species, and that almost 99% of the species that have one time existed have gone extinct. So just something to think about.
All right, thank you for that. What are the main causes of habitat loss, pollution, and so on, which are driving species extinction? And to what extent is agriculture, such as livestock farming and fishing, a factor in the decline of Canadian biodiversity and a threat to species at risk?
Yeah, so as I mentioned in my last answer, we are largely responsible for species extinction, and that's only gotten worse as our population has grown.
And is that because of like our housing or?
Yes, yeah, so there's a lot of factors that play into it. So there's urbanization, so building of houses and roads, and also to feed us, agriculture does play a large role. Agriculture is an issue for many, many different reasons. First of all, because of all of the land that it uses. Yeah. Obviously, not only for them to live on and graze on, but to grow feed for animals. Animal agriculture is also an issue for greenhouse gas production, because a lot of livestock have different digestive systems than us, and so they ferment their food in their stomachs, which creates a lot of methane, as you all know. People blame cows for a lot of greenhouse gas releases, and that's totally true. Fishing is also an issue, not only for plastic pollution from fishing nets. As much as 46% of plastic by weight is fishing nets in oceans, so that's an issue. But also, we're overfishing because every species of fish reproduces at a different rate, but we're just fishing faster than they can reproduce. And even if we notice that it's an issue and try to dial back or stop it, we just assume that stopping the exploitation will allow them to come back, but that's not a guarantee, especially because after we diminish their population so much, it's hard. There could be a bunch of different reasons now responsible for their loss. So that's also an issue because we expect that we can stop and they'll come back, and that's not always the case. And so aside from animal agriculture and fishing, there's also other reasons that species are declining, like pollution, which can be like animal waste, also from animal agriculture, sewage, fertilizers and pesticides, and plant nutrients that can also lead to eutrophication in waters that results in just fish dying from lack of oxygen. And also, you mentioned urbanization and building of houses, and that results in habitat like fragmentation and destruction, and that even prevents species from simply moving from one place to another. Climate change directly impacts species because as their planet warms, it's too warm for them and they need to move somewhere colder, which isn't possible for all species because some of them are already at their northernmost limits, like polar bears, or some species simply can't move far enough, like think of small insects. Or they just don't have the time. Even an issue is our renewable infrastructure, like hydroelectric dams. A lot of fish die simply by swimming through the blades of them, or the building of the dams cuts off the waterways, and that's really important for fish species. So there's many different things like invasive species. Species extinction is driven by a slew of things. Some are our faults, some aren't. But yeah, there's many of them, and every species reacts differently to it depending on where they are in their trophic level, if they're specialists or generalists, etc.
So I have one more question for Carolina. Some experts say that at a certain point there could be a critical loss of species, triggering a domino effect and causing a mass extinction. The ocean seems to be at risk of this sort of thing. They're throwing around the year 2050 as a possible year for something like this. And life on land is not immune from these threats as well. Is this just talk? Is this just fear-mongering that's happening? Or is this for real? Like, is this a legit scenario that we could see in our lifetime?
Yeah, so in oceans, past reasons for extinctions or mass extinctions have been acidification, because oceans act as a carbon sink, so they absorb our carbon dioxide, and that results in the pH of the oceans decreasing. So that is probably what will happen for the next ocean mass extinction. But it's also important to note that when we lose species, it sets off a chain reaction, so that's also why people normally think of an extinction of one species could easily lead to a mass extinction, just because if a predator loses its prey, if it doesn't find an alternative, they obviously will die off quickly. So those lead to co-extinctions, and every species has a minimum viable population size, like I mentioned earlier, that they need, and an area. So if they go below that in the number of individuals that they have or the land that they occupy, they won't do well too fast. So there's just a lot of things that if one factor changes, fast die-off can happen. So while I do currently believe that we're in a period of like a 6th mass extinction, I don't know, it could be all talk, but I don't know if it'll happen as fast as we think it will. Like, I don't think there'll be a day where every species dies off or anything. And it's important to note that we have been losing species for hundreds and thousands of years. So it is kind of a slow burn to it. So I can't say for sure if it's fact or fiction, but that we don't know, and it probably won't happen as fast as some of the stats make it seem like it will.
All right, thank you very much for that. We're now going to move on to John Stone, who will answer the next couple of questions for us. Are you ready, John?
Sure.
All right. So tell us about, in your professional experience, what are the causes of climate change, and do you see animal agriculture as playing a role, and in what way?
My biggest challenge is going to be able to limit what I'm going to say to less than an hour.
I'm going to cut you off if you're too long.
Professors have a terrible tendency of doing that.
Can you guys hear John?
Can you not hear me? Is that better?
Can you hear him now?
This
Yeah?
machine is working, I hope. Okay. Well, climate change is no longer a new issue. It really came to public fore in about 1988 for a series of reasons. But it's even worse. The science of climate change is not new. The science of climate change goes back to about 150 years with the work of a French mathematician called Joseph Fourier and a Swedish chemist called Svante Arrhenius. And they hypothesized that the planet Earth that we live on is warmer than it would be normally expected given its distance from the sun. And they postulated that, in fact, the reason that the Earth is that much warmer by as much as 30 degrees Celsius is because of a blanket of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. If it wasn't for those greenhouse gases, this planet would be all year round about 30 degrees Celsius cooler. The reason we've got these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is because of biological, physical, and other reasons. But more recently, it's because of the combustion of fossil fuels, coal, oil, gas, and the like. And as we burn those fossil fuels, we create carbon dioxide, which goes up into the atmosphere and can stay there for as much as 1,000 years. And what has happened is because the increase of emissions and concentrations, the atmosphere is getting warmer and warmer, and the climate is changing. The Earth's balance is not what it should be. We deposit into the atmosphere every year about 35 gigatons of carbon. Now, giga prefix means 10 to the 9, that's 1,000 million tons of carbon dioxide goes into the atmosphere every year. Another 3 gigatons goes in from agriculture, forestry, and land use change, such as deforestation. About 10 gigatons is taken up by the biology of the earth, the fact that trees grow, grass grows, etc. And another 10 gigatons is taken up by the oceans through physical, chemical, and biological means. If you do the arithmetic, what that tells you is that there's about 15 to 16 gigatons of carbon that is added to the atmosphere every single year. And the longer this goes on, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is going to increase, and it's going to destabilize the climate.
So you mentioned fossil fuels. Do you have a lot of information yourself on the contribution of animal agriculture to these greenhouse gases?
Well, forestry, agriculture, and land use change totally, it's about 20-25% contribution to the increase of carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere.
Okay. So the next question I have for you, John, is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the United Nations body for assessing the science related to climate change, says that we only have 11 or 12 years left to turn things around. On our current course, in your professional opinion, what can we expect to see locally and globally over the next 10, 20, or 50 years?
The problem with climate change, it's slow acting and it's cumulative. What we need to do is to avoid dangerous influence with the climate system. Now that's a legal term, that word dangerous. It's not one that can be defined scientifically. It depends on what we value. And governments have been wrestling with this question for 30 odd years or so, and have decided that they have to avoid temperatures in the atmosphere increasing by more than 2 degrees Celsius from what they were in the pre-industrial level. Pre-industrial means 250 years ago. We already have seen an increase of the temperatures in the atmosphere of about 1 degree Celsius. Now you might say 1 degree Celsius, that's nothing. But the difference between a glacial period and an interglacial period is only about 5 degrees Celsius. Carbon dioxide, which is the most important greenhouse gas, stays in the atmosphere for as long as 1,000 years. All the time it's building up in concentrations and absorbing heat and making the atmosphere more and more warm and affecting the climate. And this is likely to go on increasingly until we stabilize the climate. And to stabilize the climate, we have to stabilize the concentrations in the atmosphere. And that means that we have to reduce our emissions to an extent that the amount of greenhouse gases going up into the atmosphere equals the amount of greenhouse gases that are being taken up by the land and ocean surfaces. If we want to keep at that 2 degrees Celsius target, that means that greenhouse gas emissions have got to peak and then decline. And if you want to keep that 2 degrees Celsius, it means that the greenhouse gas emissions have got to peak somewhere in the next 10 to 20 years and be at least half of what they are now by the 2050.
I'm going to throw something out there extra at you, if you don't mind. From a government policy point of view, what would be some of the most effective policies that could actually help contribute towards this?
Well, one is not to subsidize fossil fuels. We're subsidizing fossil fuels to a greater extent even than we are subsidizing renewable energy. But we have to remember that climate change is a long-lasting effect that we are going to see impacts because of our past emissions. As I said, they stay in the atmosphere for a long time. And so if that's the case, then we're going to see more impacts. The impacts are now inevitable, and we're going to have to adapt to those changes. And adaptation is something that this particular federal government doesn't seem to have paid much attention to. But I could go on. I don't think.
Do you see other governments as being better?
Yes.
Yes?
But we shouldn't put all the onus on pure governments. Governments
not.
can set the
That's why I'm vegan.
tone, but it depends what we do as individuals as well. And we should think always about our consumption, because it's consumption which usually derives a lot of the emissions, and our energy use, and try to be as economical as possible. For example, I don't have a clothes dryer. I've never had a clothes dryer, because I can dry my clothes in the basement in the winter because the water vapor is very low, and in the summer I can dry them outside on a washing line. But you need to stop and sort of think, where do I use this energy? Can I use it more efficiently? It all depends on what we buy, and it depends on our lifestyles. And our lifestyles are things that, by and large, we don't choose. They're sold to us. They're sold to us by our friends, by what we see on the television, they're listening to the radio, reading our newspapers. And the lifestyles that people who've got grey hair like myself had when they were students, it was very different than they are today's students, but they were just as much fun and just as fulfilling. So it's a matter of choosing what sort of lifestyles we want.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I would say that the drum I've been banging in my 10 plus years of activism has been around what can we as individuals be doing to impact in a more positive way our environment. And I think it's only now in the last few years where there's been a lot more attention being paid by the public to this, and calls to the government to do something that that I think that this has been a dialogue that's moved into the mainstream and isn't just happening amongst sort of some fringe groups. So
We've at least got a government now that doesn't deny climate change.
Well, that is a start.
But we have to work hard to ensure that we increase our ambition, because it's not enough.
All right, thank you for that, John. Next, we'll move on to Annie. Annie is a social scientist, as you'll recall. So Annie, although there's been a lot of doom and gloom talk, and this really hasn't been like the most up, discussion here today so far, but that's because it's a serious topic. Well, there's been a lot of doom and gloom. There's also been talk about change. So building upon what John was just talking about, how can individuals make changes, or in this case, get involved with animal or environmental activism?
Okay, this question is very interesting and important because there are many ways people can get involved in animal and environmental activism, but it depends on how they feel comfortable with taking risk as an advocate. So first of all is being
Annie, I'm just going to ask you to talk a little louder, I think.
Really?
Can you guys hear her? Okay.
Is that okay?
Just a little.
So first of all is being aware of what you are doing. As scientists have demonstrated, adopting a vegan lifestyle is the best way to reduce our ecological footprint. So get informed about the everyday products you are using, because veganism is far from only food, which is essentially having a plant-based diet. Second is changing your consumer habits. So there are alternative options for food, cosmetic, and clothes made out of animals' bodies, and that you might want to buy instead of mainstream items. this would lead you to adopting an ethical vegan lifestyle, which is less complicated than you would imagine because there are more and more non-harmful options. Sorry. There are more and more non-harmful options as we don't need to eat, wear, test, and be entertained by animals. But to produce real social change, people have to be more active. So I'll present some tactics here. So first of all, with little risk or cost of participation, that has potential to reach large number of people. There are education tactics. For example, there is public and hashtag campaigns like Meet the Victims campaign. People can also circulate speeches on Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube. And people can also sign and circulate petitions. So another tactics is legal mobilization, like Ecology Ottawa and Vegan Option Canada do. And another tactics is public demonstration. This one is very important because they typically involve a large number of people, gain media attention, and also cause disruption. So I have some example of groups here. So there is the Save movement that usually holds vigils at the entrance of slaughterhouses. There is also Anonymous for the Voiceless that you can participate in what they call a Cube of Truth. And there is Nation Rising, that will hold an event at the Parliament Hill on June 15 to demand the government stop subsidizing animal agriculture. And also, after this panel ends today, there will be the National Animal Rights Day demonstration. So I encourage you to participate because it's important and you are already here. So the last tactics I'll present today is direct action activism. So for example, there is direct action everywhere. There is also the Animal Liberation Front, the Extinction Rebellion, and the Fridays for the Future and Climate Strike. So the risk of getting involved with authorities and the cost of participation is higher. But according to Erika Chenoweth, who is a political scientist at Harvard University, peaceful resistance and non-violence civil disobedience are the most powerful action for social change. Because, she says, only 3.5% of the population is needed to ensure serious political change. So this means that in the National Capital Region, with about 1 million people, only 35,000 people would have to come out to get social change. And I'll conclude with this. Although it is important to adhere to an ethical vegan lifestyle, we have to go further than our everyday life if we want to produce if we want to produce significant social change.
So I'm just going to slip something else in there, but I'll be gentle. One thing I did not hear in some of the things you were just talking about is the line of advocacy that I would say I've engaged in for the past 10 years. For example, food advocacy or building community and that sort of thing around it. It's like I personally, my work and the nature of my work does not make me feel comfortable doing protest, for example. But I've also handed out probably like 10,000 vegan cookies in my advocacy career. Do you think that there's also an opportunity for people who are maybe limited in what they're able to do to engage in ways that are maybe not even, thousands of people coming out, but just in their interactions with their day-to-day people who they come in contact with?
Yeah, obviously the most important here is just to get involved, which is it can be in your everyday life or with groups. So just get involved if you want to really change the world.
I feel like we're close to a tipping point with this stuff, would you say?
Sorry?
We're close to like a tipping point. Like you mentioned 3.5%. Malcolm Gladwell in The Tipping Point identified 10% as a marker after which you see social change really occurring. I guess what you're saying is anything that sort of helps build that number so that it becomes normalized, really.
So obviously here what these political scientists have studied is those people who do civil disobedience and resistance.
Yeah.
But on one side, people will have to go in the street to demand something. But if people do also something in their everyday life,
Yeah.
We do many action. We cannot just focus on one action
Yeah.
if we really want to change things.
So everybody can feel empowered, even if they say one thing might not work for them. There's lots of different ways that people can get
Exactly.
involved. Yeah. Okay. The next question, and this I'm starting with a bit of a statement here. Greta Thunberg, who started the Fridays for Future movement, was the most quoted person at Davos, and is recently nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize, is vegan and advocates that governments declare a climate emergency, that countries and businesses should be starting to prioritize the planet over profits. Is this feasible? Is it possible to change our society through these types of means, and if so, how?
Okay. So I really like this question because critical animal studies scholar activists argue since the early 2000s that capitalism and anthropocentrism are social roots of economic exploitation and also all forms of oppression. And just to specify, anthropocentrism means that humans consider themselves superior to animal and nature, which somehow justify their exploitation. But ethical veganism opposes this point of view, which is often misunderstood as a personal choice, while it's not, because veganism brings across the idea of equality and cross-species community. For instance, vegetarian and flexitarian diet aren't worth being accepted because vegetarians still exploit animals through some food, clothes, and entertainment. Therefore, they participate in industrial profits over the animals and the environment. So rejecting capitalism and anthropocentrism would be an option to prioritize the planet over profits. But also, I have some difficulty with this microphone. Okay, so also, many eco-activists call for action and propose that on one side, people should make more ethical choices, but on the other side, they ask the government should make a vegan lifestyle mandatory and facilitate accessibility to vegan and fresh food. But also, they ask the government withdraw subsidies to agriculture and help farmers to transit from to growing crops. They also demand to render illegal commodities made out of animals, as single-use plastic is on the way of becoming illegal. So to change society, we could start by seeing ourselves as equal to the complex of nature, environment, animal. And if collectively we overcome the idea that we are superior to animals, ethical behavior toward the environment should naturally fall into place.
All right, thank you for that. Ikram, you've been waiting very patiently, listening to everybody. We have two questions for Ikram before we pose some questions to all the panelists and then open the floor. So this question is about the environmental and the vegan movements. When I first, like I mentioned, when I first went vegan, I looked around at what organizations were here locally, and I came across some environmental organizations. But to me, I didn't feel that there was a good fit for me because none of them really talked about animal agriculture or changing diet. So I ended up just making my own organizations around veganism. But I think things have changed a little bit maybe in the last number of years. So can you tell us a little bit about what common goals environmental and vegan movements share in the context of climate change and species extinction? And should people get involved in one or the other, or do they have to even choose?
So environmental and vegan movements both seek to create change related to climate change and species extinction. Generally, environmental movements focus on system change, whereas vegan movements focus on system and lifestyle change. So people can get socially and politically active at different levels of engagement. Prior to going vegan 5 years ago, I started off with the environmental movements, and I was unaware of the environmental impacts my lifestyle choices had. I saw the documentary Cowspiracy, and that helped open my eyes. So that documentary talks about animal agriculture in relation to climate change, and it touches on cattle farming, so the methane that gets released, as our panelist mentioned earlier. I believe people should get involved in the vegan movements and bring awareness to environmental groups as we support one another in fighting for the same cause. So it doesn't have to be one or the other, we can do both. And there's also other forms of activism that we can get involved with. So anything that speaks to us. And I do encourage us all to move towards higher levels of engagement, but at lower levels, we can do online petitions. So there's websites like Care2, Lend Now that we can go to sign some petitions. We could also attend social events and build community, as Pamela does. We could also go to potlucks, meetups, meet other people that are like-minded and share our goals and our views. People can get more involved by attending talks and participating in protests, like the climate emergency ones Ecology Ottawa had recently. There's also the Cube of Truth that Anonymous for the Voiceless does every Saturday in Byward Market. You could also partake in leafletting. There's a huge protest coming up on June 15 called Nation Rising that you can be involved in. People will be protesting the government subsidies and asking the Canadian government to align subsidies with the new Canadian Food Guide change. For those unaware, the Canadian Food Guide omitted dairy this year, so we're asking them to align their subsidies with that change, along with other things they can do by supporting what they're speaking on when it comes to incorporating more plant-based foods. We need to see more subsidies in that sector. And then at higher levels of engagement, we start talking about sacrifice, like the 1,000 or so people who got arrested for occupying bridges in London. Now that isn't for everyone, but that is the highest level, I think, or putting yourself in danger.
So continuing along the lines of people's personal activities, Greta Thunberg, who we mentioned, doesn't take the airplane, and she's vegan. Do you think it's important that people take steps like limiting travel and going vegan in their personal life?
Absolutely. So plane travel.
What happened?
Check.
Okay, it works.
Is especially harmful. According to the David Suzuki Foundation, when jet fuel is burned, carbon dioxide is released along with water vapor, nitrous oxide, sulfate, and other harmful things. A special characteristic of aircraft emissions is that most of them are produced at cruising altitudes high in the atmosphere. Scientific studies have shown that these high altitude emissions have a more harmful climate impact because they trigger a series of chemical reactions and atmospheric effects. Limiting travel is a significant action we can all take. The cheap airfares are taxing the environment. However, going vegan is certainly an even more significant action that needs to be taken. Animal agriculture, as we heard from the other panelists, is one of the leading causes of climate change and species extinction, and it's the leading cause of deforestation and water depletion. So making more conscious and compassionate consumer choices results in significantly decreasing the use of fresh water, acres of forests, pounds of grain, and it also saves sentient beings' lives. The UN Food and and Agriculture Organization estimates that the livestock sector contributes 14.5% of total man-made greenhouse gas emissions. Beef and milk production make up the majority of this. And as a result, many individuals are cutting beef from their diets. However, they are switching to chicken, which has caused a huge increase in chickens slaughtered annually to meet this demand. So in Canada, almost 800 million animals are killed in Canada each year, and most of them are chickens. The key is to eliminate all animal products and byproducts from our diets and lifestyles, along with doing smaller actions like not traveling by plane.
To stay at home.
Yes.
Okay, so I have two questions that I'm going to pose to all the panelists. You guys get 2 sentences each. No time to think. This is the lightning round. So the first question, and this is a double-barreled one, what can the average person do to get involved? And in your mind, what would have the greatest impact? Who wants to start?
I can start.
Okay. You've had a break.
Yeah, might as well. So not even going to mention going vegan vegetarian because we've talked about it. Obviously, biggest impact, you probably all are, done. But yeah, limiting air travel, limiting food waste especially, because I think that's something that a lot of people forget to think about. That creates a lot of greenhouse gases. So try not to throw away food. Another thing is if you don't want to do activism, even contacting just your MPs or MPPs is something that a lot of people forget they can do because they are kind of your voice in Parliament. Tell them what you like to do and find an organization that's doing work and join them is also a good idea.
Always try to be better. John, do you have what you would think would be the top?
Well, there are two things. First of all, I'm not sure it's necessary to say this in this crowd, is vote. Don't underestimate that. Don't stay home. The other thing to say is that very often politicians follow what the public wants. You might not believe that, but it's in fact the case. And so if there is a chance to go on Parliament Hill, stand on the steps, as I've done, and argue for change, then do it. But we've got to insist to the politicians that words are not enough, that we really want to see actions.
All right, thank you. Annie?
Okay. So although an ethical vegan lifestyle is necessary for everyone, well, people can also educate, can also participate in public demonstration or do direct action activism. Because social change will be greater and faster if everyone gets involved to challenge authorities. But also getting involved in activism means feeling a part of a community, working on common goals, living in alignment with your values, and also sharing the grief of the grief about the treatment of animals and the destruction of the planet.
Thank you. Ikram?
So change begins with you, with me, with each individual on this planet. The overturn of individual consciousness will create a ripple effect in the collective consciousness. I encourage us all to lead compassionate, sustainable, and conscious lifestyles. This begins with what we consume as consumers. As there is concern over the fueling our vehicles, there needs to be a higher concern over the fueling our bodies. So we must vote with our dollar to see the change we want to see. Support vegan businesses, our local farmers markets, zero-waste grocery stores, eco-fashion stores, and any green initiatives that stores are providing. We need to go vegan for the animals, our planet, and health. Also, get involved in what you're most passionate about, animal rights activism or environmental activism, or any form. As long as you're doing your part, that's all that matters. To change the system, we need all kinds of people. So people with IT knowledge to manage activist websites and databases, visionaries to imagine a culture and society where the Earth's 8 billion people can live in harmony with nature, graphic artists to make posters, people from all sectors of the economy, including fossil fuel and animal agriculture, to reimagine their industries and get reskilled if necessary. We need to think about and protect people already bearing the effects of climate change as well, many of whom are impoverished and did not contribute to the ecological crisis as much as we do in the West. And we also need to accept migrants. We need to work together to demand change and work to make change happen. So the following quote is a beautiful quote that I'd like to share. It's by political activist Arundhati Roy. "The system will collapse if we refuse to buy what they are selling. Their ideas, their weapons, their wars, their version of history, their notion of inevitability. Remember this, we be many and they be few. They need us more than we need them. On a quiet day, another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing."
And the last question for all the panelists is kind of a yes/no answer, although you may wish to elaborate a little bit. The Green New Deal that's being discussed, do you believe that it should target eliminating animal agriculture, especially factory farms?
Yes, actually, I work with Our Time Ottawa. That is a youth-led campaign pushing for a Green New Deal for Canada. And recently there were a bunch of town halls hosted where people just like you and me came to discuss what they would want to see in a Green New Deal because we aren't writing policy. And you'd be surprised at every single one someone did mention, like stopping animal agriculture or especially factory farming. So it is something that people understand the link between. So for sure.
That's a yes. John, your thoughts?
At the risk of having to make a very hurried exit,
We're not done with you yet.
I would not agree with you entirely.
No?
I think people have to have choices, but I think the choices need to be informed choices, and not to excess. But so I guess in short, one letter, no, I don't agree with you.
Okay. Annie?
Okay.
We know.
Animal exploitation is not sustainable for the environment, for the animal, and for us. So not only we must eliminate animal agriculture, but we also must eliminate every form of animal exploitation and human exploitation.
Ikram?
Yes. I think we need to turn the factory farms into greenhouses.
All right. So before I hand it over to you guys for questions, I just want to mention that Edelweiss, who spoke at the beginning, she will have information about Extinction Rebellion available on the way out. It's an organization, a direct action group related to climate change. So if you're interested in that, then stop by and talk to her. So, okay, so we've heard a lot of stuff in the last hour or so, almost. Does anybody have anything that they want to say, anything that they want to ask, any points that they would like to elaborate on, anything you're confused about? Yes?
Yes, I've noticed recently as the more popular, animal agriculture is almost striking back. So for example,
Oh yeah, they're scared.
I was at the cinema a few years ago and I was incensed that this, not a few years ago, I was incensed at this McDonald's advert that basically portrayed ranch farmers in Alberta as being very ecologically conscious, like showed them in a nice green field. And to me, that, like a lot of people would be sort of, they would take that as face value when thinking about the enormous environmental costs of animal agriculture in Alberta. And I'm just wondering what we can do to sort of push back against that, propaganda machine about animal agriculture, coming back to try and stop the
When we have the TV and the radio stations supporting the animal agriculture, that's not right. We should have the same platform to be able to push back for the animals and for the abuse that's being done to them just by standard farming practices. And there'll never be, and this is not because I'm pushing for the pet industry. I have a lot of stuff against that, but there'll never be any laws to protect animals as long as there's animal agriculture on this planet, because no animals will have any protection as long as we are allowed to abuse animals for food and to slice an animal's throat so that we can eat their flesh is only going to continue to make that animal a commodity. So we need to have more of a platform. These associations that run the animal agriculture are bursting at the seams with money to be able to afford the commercial, and we need to write to the TV stations and the radio stations and tell them that they should not be supporting animal agriculture.
So what I didn't tell everybody, but anyone who knows me, is I'm in marketing and PR, and that's what I've been doing for the past 16 years. I would say that within the vegan community, we have a problem with not supporting the organizations that want to do good work along those types of fronts. I've been involved with a number of different organizations that were volunteer-based, struggled to have money, struggled to have, resources, and I think that we need to do better at supporting the people that stand up and are willing to stick their neck out and do that kind of work. So,
but I think we need to fight for the government to stop giving the money to these
that's another
these
point.
organizations, and they should not be making contributions to politicians so as to keep the money flowing into their industries.
Yeah, that's
like
another
Mr.
battle.
Scheer standing there drinking a carton of milk. He's not getting my vote for that, So it's just the unfairness that my tax dollar has to go for something I'm totally against.
Yeah, I don't disagree. You
mentioned McDonald's, and consumers are supporting McDonald's. So people have to stop supporting McDonald's. If McDonald's wasn't selling the product, they would switch. If they
and how do we
if-
do that? Things like Beyond Burger
Yes.
that a lot of vegans complain endlessly about because it's not vegan enough.
Yeah. Well, so A&W has a market out there. So if we support a product that is, even though you're going to a place that has a meat product beside you, but if we don't put our dollars in McDonald's.
More people are buying Beyond Burgers instead of the other burgers, eventually.
Yeah.
Like I have omnivore friends who will only eat those now. Like they just won't eat a fast food hamburger anymore. It's tough, right? Because you don't want to support these like evil companies. But and I personally, just to be clear, like my bias is I've worked for like half a dozen of those businesses out there. And then they've also, well, I guess I've worked for most of them when I was running VegFest. But, I've done a lot to support those businesses, and we all need to support those businesses. But at the same time, if we want to see mass change, it has to be through partnering with these groups that maybe or not, even if we're not partnering like per se, but like supporting those efforts to bring it to the masses, because that's how, in my mind, we're going to start seeing a bigger.
Check. Hi. One of the things I struggle with is Indigenous peoples across the world have lived off of hunting and trapping and fishing for millennia. They're also on the forefront of the struggle for the environment. They're in the sacrifice zones. Their lands are being destroyed. Their women are being raped by man camps that go into work in places like the tar sands. We can't ask them to be vegan. Their culture has been living off the land with nature and with plants and animals, living in, like. Hello, check. Sorry. I am very much vegan. I've supported veganism. I'm against industrial agriculture, even against regular animal agriculture, because it's, as George Monbiot has said, you're still tearing up land that could be lived on by wildlife, right? So my question is, how do we promote at the same time not alienate our allies in
I deeply respect First Nations traditions and customs, and I am deeply ashamed of what we Westerners have done in terms of genocide and removing them from their land. I think, however, that 99% we agree with First Nations, what they are doing, and we are actually not asking them to stop their traditional practices of hunting and fishing. What we are talking about is the over half of the arable land on this planet, which is being used for animal agriculture, and which, as a result of removing species, taking up habitat, and the production of greenhouse gases, we are destroying the planet. So we are not talking about asking First Nations people, Indigenous people, not to do their traditional fishing and trapping. But unfortunately, we have sort of taken over their traditions in addition to the residential schools. So it's not the traditional fishing and hunting that is the problem, but it is the participation in our Western society's habit of factory farming, industrial animal agriculture, and in any case, I think that's, we definitely stand with them, and so grateful for them.
I have a point to add to that. So you mentioned it's culture, and I think that's exactly the problem with whether it's Indigenous or even our traditional, our traditional diet. It is culture. It's not like we're not made to eat those things. It's just something that's been culture. So I think explaining that is helpful. And also, I spoke to an elder once from Nunavut who talked about polar bears and how they are going extinct slowly up in the north. And there is regulations now where they can only hunt, I believe, once a year in certain areas. So they are abiding by those laws and doing what they can do for climate change. Perhaps they'll see more regulations as climate change worsens in the future. So this is an example of what they are doing. For other animals, I think it's more of a moral issue since they're not contributing to factory farming and they're not purchasing that typically, they're hunting it themselves. So in terms of climate change, they may not be causing too much there. However, it would be a moral issue, and I think that's where we kind of have trouble, because they have their beliefs and their spiritual beliefs tying to that, and it's hard to speak on that as an outsider. So we can do what we can do from our end by standing in solidarity with them and being on the front lines with them as well and applauding them for everything they do.
Can I just add one thing really quick?
Yes.
So I do also want to point out that the issue is our Western lifestyle of overconsumption. The Indigenous people to Canada, the way that their lifestyle was definitely not vegan, and it still isn't. But they did live in a sustainable way. Like somehow they lived here for so many years without creating all of this trash and all of this pollution and all of burning all these fossil fuels. So if they were able to live in a sustainable way, there's no reason to, I think, to limit their lifestyles. Like we've already done so much to them. Their way of life isn't the issue, it's ours. So that's why we need to step up and make this change.
So we have at the back, but you were next.
Yes.
You'll be next.
Thanks. My name is Nathan. I had two questions. The first was, Annie, you talked about ending both animal exploitation and human exploitation. So transitioning to a vegan lifestyle doesn't automatically fix the issue of human exploitation. Shifting to agriculture, for example, such as almond farming, represents a lot of water use, as well as abuse of workers in plantations, for example. So how do you reconcile, how can the vegan movement do a better job of promoting elimination of human exploitation when there's been a pretty poor record of doing that in the past, especially with indigenous rights, for example? My second question is, as Carolina was pointing out around the Green New Deal, a lot of the messaging about climate change in the past in like the initial 2000s, for example, was ending fossil fuels. But as the movement progressed and policies started to adapt, we've started seeing a shift to not just simply ending fossil fuel usage, but having a plan to shift to end fossil fuel consumption. So moving from not just banning fossil fuel usage overnight, but having a just transition, for example, so that workers in oil fields could be trained to move to renewable energy sectors. So we can't just overnight shift to everyone living a vegan lifestyle, right? A lot of fisher folks, hundreds of thousands of people rely on animal agriculture. So what would be a plan? How would we develop a plan where this would be more palatable for the public, politicians, to understand what a transition would look like?
Okay, that's a good question. And as a sociologist, I don't have any solution to propose. So people who work in animal or environmental group would have better answer than I. So I don't know if one of my both colleagues here would like to answer.
I don't remember the first question.
That was a long question.
It was about human exploitation, so making sure that the vegan movement also promotes human rights.
Okay.
I mean, obviously, I don't make policy either, but maybe the billions of dollars that go to factory farming and big agriculture could be used to provide more of a livable wage and better working conditions for those that farm other more sustainable, less animal harming practices. But
first is our story of the Europeans. So when they come to us, they see our lifestyle. We live off the land, and they see all those things, and then they completely change the way we live. So when they come, they don't come with the means of really helping with what they see. They come they take the food as a means of control. So the first thing that they do to control the people, they take the power of us to get the food, and then they control it. For example, when I came to Canada, I was very surprised that no one does any farming. Everybody works in the office, and everybody is talking about a vegan lifestyle. We're already wrong. So if we are not farming and then producing our own food, we shouldn't even be talking about being vegan. I mean, we talk about traveling, we take our car, that's good, we will do it very fast. But the first thing will be for us to produce our own food, and then now we can say we are slowly changing the process of the way food is being grown. So when I came to Canada, I did the farming, and then what my example was the Canadian people don't really understand the farming, so I will what I did, so they take a lot of people from the Caribbean or poor countries, and then they work in those little farm at Leamington and Windsor. They get $5 very cheap. So there's one part of when we get the food in Canada, we say, oh, it's good in Canada, but it's good very cheaply. So we're already out of the scope of being vegan. So my question would be how do we really look at food if we're not producing it? And then we talk about vegan when we don't really look at our lifestyle on a personal level, the way we are affected. And then my other question would be, since the food is being used as a means of control, to control the people, how do we plan on changing that in a global scale? I think we can start by ourselves, but in the global scale, when this food, for example, the first thing that they do, I'm from AD, the first thing that they do, we used to produce a lot of rice, cacao, sugar cane, everything. So what they did, they destroy everything that we have. They spray it, the US, they spray the rice, the biggest production of rice in South America, and then they give us the cheap rice that they have that people cannot even digest. So that's one means of controlling, and they keep putting. Even same example for the native people, they keep crushing them. So how, I mean, and the European mindset, yes, we are doing vegan, but I'm trying to see how the changes that you're talking about is gonna go by being passive about it, because the vegan lifestyle is a passive movement, you know. So aggressively is probably, I don't know how we will go aggressively about it. So I'm just trying to see how you guys try to approach this issue. Thank you.
Darlene would like to respond.
Yeah, so I have three things that I wanted to say, and I'll answer one. If you look at the government, the current federal government, and the subsidies that they actually give subsidies to the animal agriculture and reduce laws to allow immigrants to come in and work on Canadian farms. So our government is complicit, very complicit in that. They make it easier for people who are impoverished and disadvantaged to work in slaughterhouses. And the businesses know that. Maple Leaf Foods, any of the big biz, they purposely bring in the immigrants because they know that they can get them for cheap. And our government is right along there with them. So if you want that to change, you've got to talk to your MP, you've got to talk to your government, and you've got to vote. The second thing, yeah, I'm going to talk about that. Somebody asked a question about advertising, McDonald's. So recently there was advertisement on the air as well as on TV from the Milk Board of Canada, the Dairy Board of Canada, about how cows are treated and wonderful milk and all this. Well, we actually filed complaints with the Canadian advertising standards. They were forced to shut it down. It works, so use it. We shut down a dairy ad on TV and on the radio. We've also shut down other ads. So for example, Jack Astor's, they had an ad down in Toronto, in downtown Toronto. They were making fun of vegans. Why would you be, I forget what it was, but they were making fun of vegans. So of course, we saw it. We bashed them, of course, on their site and said, like, how can you possibly do that? We went, again, to the Canadian Advertising Standards Act. We said, this is disrespectful, it's not. They took the ad down. It was a big, huge ad that they had in front of the restaurant. It does work, you just have to use it, and you have to get a lot of people using it. And then somebody said about the subsidies and their tax dollars, come out to Nation Rising, June 15th. That's, I mean, if you're really interested in where your tax dollars are going and the billions upon billions and billions of dollars that are going into subsidizing our health, that are damaging our health, damaging the environment, and killing billions of animals, then you need to be there and support us.
I think we're nearly out of time, but if there's one more question, yeah? All right, do you want to?
Number one, is Canada putting any incentives on the board for farmers to change from factory farming to producing plants? Number two is, what's the best answer on the panel to when you get your protein coffee?
I don't eat protein. Oh, looks like Darlene's got something to say again.
So again, it's what Nation Rising is all about. So we have three demands. One is that the federal government and the provincial governments stop subsidizing animal agriculture and shift those subsidies to plant-based crops and agriculture. Second demand that we have is that they enable farmers to shift to crop-based farming because it's better for them. We have no hate for farmers. We do not want them to be poor. We don't want them to lose their businesses. But they want subsidies. They need subsidies to convert over to a healthier type of crop. And the third, and this has to do with Indigenous as well, is that we want to see more support and availability of subsidies as well for the Indigenous and the impoverished so that they can eat healthier, and there should be no poverty in Canada. With what we can grow in Canada in terms of crops, there should be no poverty. If we got rid of animal ag, everybody would be eating. So again, Nation Rising, June 15th.
So like literally everything has protein, right? But are you looking for like a snappy one-liner? Anyone have a snappy one-liner?
Oh, sorry, it's a bit more than a snappy one-liner, but study somebody called Dr. Walter Longo. He did a study of people, I believe it's 55 to 60-year-old. He looked at them, whether they ate meat or they were vegan, vegetarian, whatever. He studied them until they died, and he looked to see how long people lived. And he found people on a high-protein diet died earlier than people on an average diet. It wasn't a high-protein diet. And the people that died the earliest were people that ate meat as their protein source. Dr. Walter Longo. Walter Longo. Walter Longo. Yes, to prove that protein is a myth, that we don't need as much protein as people are trying to tell us we need.
Well, that's it. That's the first part. Like, we don't need as much as what everybody thinks, but then also protein's in everything as long as we're eating a reasonably well-balanced diet. Like, I know that's not like super snappy, and I would say in like the olden days, I would have like really good snappy responses, but I'm just not going to fight with them anymore. Like, at this point, you know, people know that history is, things are changing, and you know, the information's out there. Like, you know, when I went vegan, it was like 2004 or something like that, and the internet was like, you know, it was happening, but like certainly not the way it is now. There's information out there, there's support out there, there's groups out there doing good work, there's people studying it, there's, you know, we're experiencing a big shift right now, and everybody here today is part of that and can go away feeling empowered that they are part of something that's bigger and something that will hopefully be a better solution for our planet, for the animals, and for our own personal health. So thank you to everybody here for coming, including our panelists, everybody who sat through almost an hour and a half. I think there's another talk happening next, so either stick around for that or clear out, and maybe we'll see you around after.